When Lieutenant Colonel Peter Norman Nissen walked through the muddy construction sites near EPR in early 1916, he wasn't thinking about architectural history. He was watching British soldiers die from exposure while waiting for proper shelter. The Western Front had devoured traditional building methods. Timber was scarce, skilled carpenters were in the trenches, and every structure needed to withstand shelling. Nissen, a Canadian-born mining engineer with the Royal Engineers, had spent months observing how corrugated iron sheets lay abandoned near supply depots because nobody knew what to do with them. These curved metal panels, originally meant for roofing, were piling up while men shivered in canvas tents that collapsed under snow. The genius of Nissen's solution wasn't complexity, it was brutal simplicity. He took those corrugated sheets and bent them into a half-cylinder, creating a structure that required no internal supports and could be erected directly on the ground. In March 1916, he assembled the first prototype at Ypres using nothing but standard-issue tools and a team of 6 soldiers who'd never built anything before. The structure went up in less than 4 hours. When Nissen presented his design to British Army Command, he made one promise that changed everything. Any infantryman with basic instructions could build it in 3 days, and the materials could be transported on a single lorry. The British Army tested the concept immediately at Richborough Port, where the 172nd Tunneling Company erected 20 huts in April 1916. Each hut measured 16 feet wide and used approximately 600 square feet of corrugated steel. The curved design meant rain and shrapnel slid off instead of penetrating, and the lack of vertical walls eliminated weak points where shells could catch and tear. By June 1916, Nissen huts were appearing across every British sector of the Western Front. The War Office placed its first massive order in August, 10,000 units to be manufactured and shipped before winter. What made the Nissen hut revolutionary wasn't just speed, it was the elimination of skilled labor from the equation. Traditional military construction required carpenters, masons, and engineers. Nissen's design needed none of that. The corrugated sheets came pre-drilled with holes spaced exactly 14 inches apart. Wooden end walls arrived as prefabricated panels. The foundation was optional. Crews could bolt the hut directly to wooden sleepers or even to packed earth if necessary. A sergeant and 5 privates could unload the materials, lay out the base, and have the structure weatherproof before nightfall. During the Battle of the Somme in late 1916, construction units were erecting Nissen huts within artillery range, providing immediate shelter for wounded men being evacuated from the front lines. The hut's dimensions were calculated for maximum efficiency. The 16-foot width allowed 2 rows of bunks with a central aisle, housing 30 men comfortably or 50 in emergency conditions. The curved roof, rising to about 15 feet at its peak, provided enough vertical space that men could stand upright in most of the interior. Ventilation came from adjustable panels at each end, and the corrugated steel's natural air gaps prevented the condensation problems that plagued canvas tents. By the armistice in November 1918, British forces had deployed over 100,000 Nissen huts across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. They served as barracks, hospitals, supply depots, and command posts anywhere the Army needed instant infrastructure. The design documentation Nissen submitted to the War Office in April 1916 revealed why his hut outperformed every alternative. Traditional military construction relied on vertical framing, posts, beams, and trusses that had to be cut, fitted, and joined with precision. Nissen eliminated the entire concept of framing. His curved corrugated sheets were self-supporting, meaning the walls and roof were the same component. When you bolted one sheet to the next, you weren't just adding coverage, you were creating structural integrity. Each 16-foot section overlapped the previous one by 3 inches, and the bolts went through 3 layers of metal, creating a continuous shell that distributed weight and stress across the entire surface. The construction sequence was intentionally foolproof. Step 1. Lay wooden base plates in a rectangular outline. Step 2. Bolt vertical wooden ribs to those plates at 7-foot intervals. Step 3. Attach the first corrugated sheet to the ribs and bolt it to the base. Step 4. Add the next sheet, overlapping and bolting it to the first. Repeat until the half-cylinder was complete. Step 5. Install the wooden end walls, which came with pre-hung doors and window frames. Total assembly time with an experienced crew, 72 hours. With completely green troops, 4 to 5 days. The British Army tested this repeatedly at training camps in Dover and Southampton throughout summer 1916, timing different units to establish reliable deployment schedules. What separated the Nissen from later imitations was its relationship with available materials. Nissen designed around what Britain could actually produce under wartime conditions. The corrugated steel sheets were 26 gauge, thick enough to resist damage, but thin enough that 3 men could carry a section without mechanical assistance. The curve radius was precisely calculated so that standard sheet metal rollers at British factories could form the shape without retooling. Every bolt was 7/16-inch diameter, the same size used in ship construction, meaning supply chains didn't need special inventory. The wooden components, end walls, base plates, and interior ribs came from whatever timber was available. Nissen specifications allowed for pine, oak, or even salvaged wood from damaged buildings. Field adaptability made the system nearly universal. In Mesopotamia during 1917, British forces built Nissen huts without the wooden end walls, instead using bricks scavenged from ruined villages. In Egypt, engineering units set the bases directly on sand and used interior poles cut from local palm trees instead of milled lumber. The core principle remained. Those curved, corrugated sheets would form a weatherproof shell regardless of what you did with the rest. A Canadian unit at Vimy Ridge in March 1917 erected a Nissen hut during active bombardment, working in 30-minute shifts between artillery barrages. The structure was operational within 18 hours, immediately housing 40 wounded men evacuated from the Ridge assault. The speed advantage became most obvious in logistics. A single railway flat car could transport enough materials for 8 complete Nissen huts, 48 sheets of corrugated steel, wooden components, and hardware. At the military camp Etaples in France, construction teams maintained a record pace throughout 1917, one completed hut every 6 hours when working in rotation. By October 1917, Etaples had grown to accommodate 100,000 troops, almost entirely housed in Nissen structures. The camp's hospital section alone contained 300 huts, providing bed space for 12,000 patients. When the German Spring Offensive hit in March 1918 and suddenly 20,000 additional wounded needed shelter, crews erected 70 new hospital huts in 11 days. The United States Navy sent its first engineering assessment team to Britain in September 1940, 15 months before Pearl Harbor. Commander George F. Dorat, stationed at the Bureau of Yards and Docks in Washington, had explicit orders: study British temporary construction methods and determine if they could support American military expansion. Dorat spent 6 weeks touring RAF bases, Army camps, and Royal Navy installations across England and Scotland. His classified report, filed in November 1940, devoted 18 pages to the Nissen hut. He documented assembly times, material specifications, and interviewed British construction officers who'd deployed them since 1916. Dorat's conclusion was direct. The Nissen hut was the fastest field structure ever designed, but American forces would need modifications. The modifications began immediately after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The Navy Civil Engineering Corps chose Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island as the development site because it had active construction projects and direct rail access for shipping prototypes. Commander John Barney Cyrus led the design team, working with specifications Dorat had brought from Britain, along with actual Nissen hut blueprints the British government provided under Lend-Lease arrangements. The first American prototype emerged in February 1942, and it looked similar to the Nissen, but carried fundamental differences that would affect every unit built thereafter. American engineers changed the structural logic. Where Nissen used corrugated sheets as self-supporting elements bolted directly together, the Quonset design introduced an internal steel framework. This framework consisted of curved steel arches, essentially ribs made from formed steel channels, that stood independently and supported the corrugated panels. The panels no longer carried structural loads. They were cladding attached to the frame with self-tapping screws rather than through bolts. Cyrus argued this approach would create stronger buildings, capable of supporting heavier equipment loads and providing better anchor points for electrical and plumbing systems. He was correct on both counts, but he'd introduced a complexity the Nissen deliberately avoided. The framework requirement meant Quonset huts arrived at deployment sites as more components, requiring more assembly steps. A standard 40-foot Quonset needed 14 steel arch ribs, each weighing approximately 90 pounds, positioned at specific intervals and bolted to foundation plates. Only after the frame was complete could crews attach the corrugated panels. Nissen assemblies started with the panels themselves and built outward. This philosophical difference, framework first versus panels first, added between 12 and 18 hours to construction time based on tests conducted at Quonset Point in March 1942. Navy officials accepted the trade-off because they prioritized building permanence over deployment speed. American planning doctrine assumed most bases would be occupied for years, not weeks. The Quonset also incorporated features absent from the Nissen design. Interior insulation became standard, blankets of fiberglass sandwiched between the steel panels and interior plywood lining. Electrical conduits were integrated into the framework during assembly rather than surface-mounted afterward. Wooden floors replaced the Nissen's packed earth or wooden duckboards. Windows were larger and included screens. Doors used American standard hardware instead of British hinges and latches. Each improvement made sense from a comfort and functionality standpoint, and each added weight, components, and assembly time. A complete Quonset hut package weighed approximately 30% more than equivalent Nissen materials, requiring more trucks or rail cars for transport. By May 1942, the Navy had standardized 3 Quonset sizes, 20 feet wide, 40 feet wide, and the largest at 50 feet wide. Production contracts went to the George A. Fuller Company and the Strand Steel Corporation, both experienced with prefabricated steel construction. The first mass-produced units shipped to naval stations in June 1942. The steel framework that defined the Quonset created a parts dependency the Nissen never had. Each arch rib arrived as a preformed piece of steel channel bent to the precise radius needed for that particular hut size. If one rib was damaged during shipping, bent, cracked, or missing bolt holes, the entire frame's geometry could fail. Nissen huts tolerated imperfection because the corrugated panels flexed and adjusted as crews bolted them together. The panels themselves corrected minor alignment errors. Quonset ribs had to align perfectly before any exterior panels went on, which meant construction crews spent hours using levels, plumb lines, and measuring tapes to ensure every rib stood at exactly 90 degrees to the foundation and matched the spacing templates. The bolt count told the story of increasing complexity. A 16-foot Nissen hut used approximately 200 bolts total, mostly connecting corrugated panels to each other and to the wooden base. A 40-foot Quonset hut required over 700 bolts and screws. 14 arch ribs bolted to foundation plates used 6 bolts each, totaling 84. Cross-bracing between ribs added another 100 bolts. Attaching corrugated panels to the framework with self-tapping screws meant 16 screws per panel, and a 40-foot Quonset used roughly 30 panels. Then came the interior work. Plywood lining attached to the ribs, insulation fasteners, electrical box mounts, and floor joists bolted to the foundation. Every additional fastener was another opportunity for construction delays when tools broke or hardware went missing in the field. American production methods emphasized standardization that paradoxically reduced field flexibility. Quonset components were manufactured to tight tolerances in stateside factories, which ensured pieces fit together perfectly under controlled conditions. But combat zones weren't controlled conditions. When the 804th Engineer Aviation Battalion arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in January 1943, they discovered that human conditions had caused some steel ribs to rust at bolt holes during the Pacific crossing. The ribs couldn't be modified or replaced with local materials because the entire structure depended on those precisely formed arches. The engineers had to wait 3 weeks for replacement ribs to arrive from Pearl Harbor while troops slept in tents. The insulation system, while providing superior comfort, became a construction bottleneck. Quonset specifications required fiberglass batting to be installed between the corrugated exterior and interior plywood lining. This meant crews had to work in 3 stages: erect the frame, attach exterior panels, then go back inside to install insulation and interior walls. Nissen huts were single-stage construction. Once the corrugated panels were up, the structure was complete and habitable.
Interior improvements came later if time and materials allowed. At the Navy's Camp Endicott in Davisville, Rhode Island, where CB battalions trained in 1943, instructors timed both systems. An experienced crew could complete a Nissen-style hut in 48 hours. The same crew needed 96 hours for a comparable Quonset, with full insulation and interior finishing. Electrical integration added another layer of pre-planning that slowed field deployment. Quonset huts came with conduit pathways built into the framework, which meant electricians had to work simultaneously with construction crews rather than after the structure was complete. At naval air stations with abundant electrical contractors, this parallel construction worked efficiently. But in forward combat zones with limited personnel, having electricians occupy the work site while structural crews were still bolting ribs together created scheduling conflicts. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion in the Solomon Islands reported in April 1943 that electrical requirements delayed average Quonset completion by 2 full days because qualified electricians were rotating between multiple construction sites. The floor system represented perhaps the most significant speed penalty. Nissen huts had no integrated floors. Troops laid wooden duck boards or poured concrete after the structure was up. Quonset specifications required pressure-treated floor joists, plywood subflooring, and finished wood flooring, all installed during initial construction, which kept the interior clean and comfortable, but added an entire phase of carpentry work. When Major General George Patton's Western Task Force landed near Casablanca on November 8, 1942, his supply officers carried orders for immediate camp construction to support 35,000 troops. The invasion plan allocated space for Quonset huts shipped from Virginia, but combat conditions forced field commanders to make calculations the Navy hadn't tested at Quonset Point. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Thompson, commanding the 16th Engineer Battalion, watched his crew struggle with the steel framework in sand that wouldn't hold anchor bolts. The foundation plates, designed for firm ground or concrete pads, twisted when tightened because Moroccan coastal sand compressed unevenly. Thompson's after-action report filed in December 1942 noted his crews needed 4 days per Quonset hut, with most time lost stabilizing foundations and shimming framework ribs to compensate for uneven settling. British forces at the same North African theater were simultaneously deploying Nissen huts they'd shipped from Alexandria. The 512th Specialist Team Royal Engineers set up a field hospital outside Algiers starting November 12, 1942. Working with local Algerian laborers who spoke minimal English, the team completed 16 Nissen huts in 9 days. Their technique eliminated foundations entirely. They laid railway sleepers directly on graded sand, bolted the corrugated panels to those sleepers, and stabilized everything with sand berms piled against the exterior base. When windstorms hit in late November, several Quonset huts under construction toppled because their frameworks weren't yet cladded with panels. The Nissen structures, already complete with their self-supporting shells, stayed standing. The Pacific Theater exposed even starker differences on Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division began receiving Quonset huts in February 1943 after months of fighting in muddy tent camps. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Leckie, whose memoir documented the campaign, described watching construction crews work in 100-degree heat with 80% humidity. The steel framework components were too hot to handle with bare hands by mid-morning. Crews worked abbreviated schedules, dawn until 10, then evening until dark, which stretched 5-day construction estimates into 2-week realities. Meanwhile, Australian forces supporting operations from Port Moresby used Nissen-pattern huts manufactured in Sydney. Australian war production records show these simplified versions eliminated even the wooden end walls, using corrugated steel throughout, and construction teams reported average assembly times of 36 hours. Timing mattered most during rapid base expansion. When Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered the development of Funafatu Atoll in the Ellis Islands during March 1943, Navy planners needed housing for 5,000 personnel within 60 days. The 2nd Naval Construction Battalion arrived with both Quonset materials and some British Nissen huts acquired through Commonwealth supply channels.
Battalion Commander Lieutenant Commander Joseph Blondin split his crews to test both systems under identical Coral Atoll conditions. His official report in May 1943 provided exact figures. Nissen huts averaged 54 hours from first foundation timber to completed structure. Quonset huts averaged 91 hours, with the gap attributed primarily to framework alignment and interior finishing requirements. The speed differential became critical during emergency expansions. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Navy needed immediate hospital capacity at Pearl Harbor for incoming wounded. The existing hospital couldn't accommodate the surge, so construction battalions erected temporary ward buildings adjacent to the main facility. Using Quonset huts, with the required foundations, frameworks, and interior systems, would have meant a 2-week construction timeline. Instead, crews used a hybrid approach. Nissen-style corrugated shells erected in 3 days with interior medical equipment installed afterward. Those emergency wards remained in service through 1944, housing over 2,000 patients during their operational period. Weather resistance revealed unexpected trade-offs. Quonset insulation kept interiors comfortable in extreme heat and cold, but the complex wall assembly created moisture traps. In the Aleutian Islands during 1943, where fog and rain were constant, insulated Quonset huts developed condensation between the exterior steel and interior plywood, leading to rust and mold. Nissen huts, with their single-layer construction and natural ventilation through corrugation gaps, stayed drier despite being less comfortable. American industrial capacity transformed the Quonset into a mass production phenomenon that the handcrafted Nissen could never match. By July 1943, the Strand Steel Corporation's factory in Richmond, Indiana, was producing 200 complete Quonset hut packages daily, shipping them to both coasts for Pacific and European deployment. The George A. Fuller Company's plant in Pennsylvania added another 150 units per day. This production volume, over 100,000 huts annually, required standardization so rigid that every component had to be interchangeable across all units. A steel rib manufactured in January 1943 had to fit perfectly with panels and hardware made in August 1944. American factories achieved this precision through die forming and jig-based production that the British cottage industry approach to Nissen manufacturing never attempted. The standardization philosophy extended beyond just physical dimensions. Quonset huts came in exactly 3 widths: 20, 40, and 50 feet, with lengths in 10-foot increments. This modular approach meant logistics officers could calculate shipping requirements precisely. A standard 40-foot flat car carried 1 complete 40 by 20 package. Transport ships allocated cargo space in Quonset unit increments. Supply depots stocked replacement parts, knowing that any 20-foot arch rib fit any 20-foot hut, regardless of when or where either was manufactured. The system eliminated the improvisation that made Nissen huts flexible, but also made them inconsistent. Cost accounting revealed where American engineering priorities diverged from British expediency. In 1943, a complete 40 by 20 Quonset hut cost the Navy approximately $850, including all materials, hardware, insulation, electrical components, and flooring. A comparable Nissen hut, based on British production records from 1918, cost approximately $230 in inflation-adjusted 1943 currency. The Quonsets' superior comfort and electrical systems justified the higher price in American procurement doctrine, but that 300% cost increase mattered significantly when multiplying across thousands of units. The total American expenditure on Quonset production exceeded $140 million by war's end. Production volume numbers told competing stories about success. The United States manufactured approximately 170,000 Quonset huts between 1941 and 1946, an average of 34,000 per year. Britain produced roughly 100,000 Nissen huts just during World War I between 1916 and 1918, averaging 50,000 per year with far less industrial infrastructure. The difference wasn't manufacturing capability, it was design complexity. Nissen huts required corrugated steel sheets, basic fasteners, and rough timber. Any sheet metal facility could produce components. Quonset huts needed specialized steel forming for the arch ribs, precise die cutting for panel mounting holes, and coordination between insulation suppliers, electrical component manufacturers, and lumber mills. The engineering trade-offs became most visible in adaptability. After initial construction, Quonset huts could be upgraded. Crews could add partition walls, install heating systems, run additional electrical circuits, and mount heavy equipment to the steel framework. These capabilities made them suitable for permanent installations, like stateside training bases and rear echelon headquarters. Naval Air Station Alameda in California received over 400 Quonset huts in 1943 that served as workshops, classrooms, and administrative offices. Many remained in use for over 50 years until the base closed in 1997. That longevity validated the American approach for installations where permanence mattered more than construction speed. But the framework that enabled those upgrades became a liability in temporary field use. When the 43rd Infantry Division moved from Guadalcanal to New Georgia in June 1943, they couldn't disassemble and transport their Quonset huts. The steel ribs, once bolted together, were difficult to separate without damaging threads. The screwed-on panels could be removed, but without the framework, they were useless. The entire camp infrastructure, 42 Quonset huts, stayed behind, abandoned. Nissen huts disassembled almost as quickly as they erected because the bolted panels separated cleanly and could be reused elsewhere. British forces routinely relocated Nissen camps, moving the same structures from Egypt to Italy to Greece as front lines shifted. The real divergence between Nissen and Quonset legacies appeared not during wartime, but in the decade after. When World War II ended in August 1945, the United States military found itself with approximately 70,000 surplus Quonset huts scattered across domestic bases that were rapidly closing. The War Assets Administration, tasked with liquidating military surpluses, began selling complete Quonset huts to civilians in 1946 for prices between $200 and $600, depending on size and condition. That same year, over 15,000 Quonsets were purchased by farmers, small businesses, and housing desperate families across America. The hut's integrated floors, insulation, and electrical systems made them immediately habitable as homes, workshops, or storage buildings. This civilian adoption created an American architectural phenomenon that lasted decades. Drive through rural Iowa, Kansas, or Nebraska today, and you'll still see Quonset huts serving as machinery sheds and grain storage. Small airports across the Midwest used them as hangars through the 1970s. The University of Illinois housed returning veterans in a Quonset village from 1946 until 1972. 260 huts providing temporary family housing that became semi-permanent because nothing replaced them. These structures succeeded in civilian use precisely because of the features that slowed their battlefield deployment. The insulation kept them comfortable year-round. The strong framework supported shelving, equipment hoists, and modifications. The finished interiors accepted drywall and paint for those wanting conventional appearances. Britain took the opposite approach with Nissen huts after 1945. The military wanted them gone because they symbolized wartime austerity. Thousands were dismantled, with the corrugated panels sold as scrap metal during the post-war steel shortage. Some found civilian use. Farms in Yorkshire and Scotland converted them to sheep barns and equipment storage. But the British government actively discouraged civilian retention because they wanted to distance national identity from wartime temporary architecture. By 1955, most Nissen huts had vanished from Britain, except on remote military ranges and agricultural properties where practicality outweighed aesthetics. The architectural establishment treated both designs with disdain that revealed class prejudices about temporary construction. American architectural journals in the 1950s rarely mentioned Quonset huts except to condemn them as visual blight. Frank Lloyd Wright reportedly called them metal pig shelters unfit for human habitation. British architects were even harsher about Nissen huts, with one 1948 Royal Institute of British Architects publication describing them as corrugated embarrassments that should be eliminated from the landscape as quickly as economically feasible. This professional hostility ignored the practical reality that both designs had sheltered millions of people effectively and economically when alternatives didn't exist.
Commonwealth nations developed their own variants that often returned to Nissen principles. Australia's post-war reconstruction included simplified curved roof huts that eliminated American framework complexity. These structures used for immigrant housing and remote infrastructure through the 1960s prioritized speed and cost over comfort features. Canada's Department of National Defence continued manufacturing Nissen-pattern huts for northern bases where extreme cold made insulated Quonsets impractical. The single-layer metal construction prevented the catastrophic ice damming that plagued Quonset roofs when snow loads exceeded design limits. The military eventually moved beyond both designs. By the Vietnam War era, the United States had developed modular containerized housing that could be transported by helicopter and assembled even faster than Nissen huts. These systems used aluminum frameworks and fabric panels weighing a fraction of steel construction. Modern military operations use expandable container shelters that deploy in hours. But these high-tech solutions cost exponentially more. A current military shelter system runs $50,000 compared to the $850 a Quonset hut cost in 1943. When adjusted for inflation, modern systems cost roughly 6 times more per square foot than their World War II predecessors, while providing similar functionality. The fundamental lesson embedded in the Nissen versus Quonset story is that military logistics doesn't always benefit from engineering improvement. Peter Nissen created his hut by asking one question:
What's the absolute minimum needed to keep soldiers dry and alive? His answer: curved, corrugated metal bolted together. Ignored every conventional building principle. No foundations, no framing, no skilled labor required, just metal sheets and bolts. That ruthless simplicity meant a sergeant and 5 exhausted infantrymen could build shelter in 72 hours while under artillery fire. The American engineers who designed the Quonset asked a different question: how can we make this more comfortable and permanent? Their answer was objectively better architecture, but practically worse emergency shelter. This tension between optimal and adequate appears throughout military history. The M1 Garand rifle was superior to the bolt-action Springfield in every measurable way, but it was also heavier, more complex, and required more maintenance. Sherman tanks were mechanically reliable, but under-armored compared to German Panthers. American forces won with adequate equipment deployed in overwhelming numbers, rather than perfect equipment deployed slowly. The Quonset followed this pattern. It was better shelter than the Nissen, but armies needed shelter faster than they needed it better. When the 1st Marine Division was fighting in Guadalcanal mud during late 1942, having a weatherproof structure in 3 days would have mattered more than having an insulated, electrified structure in 10 days. Modern military doctrine has largely forgotten the speed versus quality calculation that World War II forced constantly. Current U.S. military construction standards assume infrastructure will be in place before major troop deployments, that supply lines will be secure, and that construction can happen without enemy interference. These assumptions held true in Iraq and Afghanistan, where American forces controlled airspace and had months to build forward operating bases. But they wouldn't hold in peer conflict scenarios where contested logistics and rapid position changes mirror World War II conditions more than recent counterinsurgency operations. The Marine Corps recognized this gap in 2019 when they reintroduced Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations, essentially relearning the lesson that speed of deployment matters more than comfort of facilities. The engineering philosophy difference extends beyond just military applications. Modern construction everywhere prioritizes complexity over simplicity. Building codes require electrical systems, insulation standards, foundation specifications, and dozens of other features that make structures better, but slower and more expensive to build. This makes perfect sense for permanent buildings, but creates problems for emergency response. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, FEMA needed immediate shelter for thousands of displaced families. The temporary housing they provided, small manufactured homes, required concrete foundations, utility hookups, and took weeks to install per unit. Nissen-style structures could have been erected in days using only the devastated area's existing infrastructure, providing immediate shelter while permanent reconstruction proceeded.
The 170,000 Quonset huts America produced represented genuine industrial achievement and provided shelter for millions of personnel across every theater. They served well in their intended role as semi-permanent base infrastructure, but they couldn't match what 6 British soldiers accomplished in 1916. Building weatherproof shelter in 3 days with nothing but hand tools and determination. That capability, that speed, that brutal simplicity was the actual innovation. The Quonset improved everything about the Nissen except the one thing that mattered most in combat: getting soldiers out of the mud and into shelter before the next bombardment started. The corrugated, curved huts still standing across farmland and former military sites are monuments to different philosophies. The surviving Quonsets prove American engineering made them durable enough to outlast their intended purpose. The vanished Nissen huts proved British engineering made them simple enough that armies could build them anywhere, anytime, under any conditions, and then abandon them without regret when the front lines moved forward. Both approaches worked, but only one could be built while the shells were still falling, and that's the difference between architectural success and battlefield necessity.